In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck.
All right, so our conversation this week is on alleviating poverty. And this is one that you were really interested in discussing. So I'm going to hand it over to you and let you pick up here and run with it.
Okay. First, I'd like to share some good news. And I think you're aware of this from the research that I sent over to you, but for our two podcast fans, which one day we may have, I'll say this. It's pretty interesting when something unprecedented has happened recently in our history. At about 1800, poverty in the world, worldwide poverty, and defined as more or less people living kind of hand to mouth, or people, producing what they need. But if something happened, if there was a drought, a famine, anything were to happen to these people, then they would very quickly be in starvation mode or survival mode. People didn't have savings, they didn't have investments, that type of a thing, for the most part. And really, if you look at the 1500s and onwards, it seems like things were kind of starting there, some developments in corporate law, some really governmental developments that I think really helped people to be able to establish some level of food security, financial security, that type of a thing. But in 1800, poverty levels were around 85 to 90%. And poverty as described, not as it's described in America. I think the poverty measurements in America right now are more or less what I understood when I was doing my research was the Census Bureau in 1969 took how much money it would cost for a family to live to have enough food, like a simple diet plan, not really expensive stuff, but enough food to survive. They multiply that times 3, and that was enough. That was kind of where they set the poverty line. And then over time, that's increased with inflation. But really, people in America are doing, the poverty line in America is much higher than it is in other countries. But this poverty line we're talking about worldwide, 85 to 90%, which, people in dire straits, if anything happened to them, any financial or environmental shock. Well, by 1980, that number had dropped to 45%, something that's never happened in the history of the world. What's even more surprising is between 1980 and today, that number's dropped to below 10%, having to do a lot with what's happened in India and China, the way those economies have opened up. One of the other things that, so I guess when we talk about what has caused it, I think one of the things that's been very beneficial that, I typically don't sing the praises of government, but government has been essential in this change that's happened in the history of our world. Without the rule of law, without enforcing contracts, without allowing people to do what they want. Like in the past, government, even in the 15, 16, 1700s, they would grant monopolies to certain people. So only, the Dutch East India Company could go to the Philippines or to the East Indies, gather those spices, bring them back, and make a ton of money. That began to change over time. The Industrial Revolution, the new technologies that sprung from that have made our lives so much better. And it's interesting, like even something as simple as, the washing machine, the dishwasher, the iron, all these things made, life so much easier for people. Not to mention what's happened, the farming equipment that we have now, industrial equipment for things like moving dirt, all these things, we just don't have to do that difficult labor anymore. Now, when we look at it, I think then we'd say, well, how much of that was just capitalism, kind of under the auspices of government enforcing contracts and those things, and how much of it was government keeping and other people keeping capitalist and wealthy industrialist greedy people under control. But it is really quite amazing what has happened, and something good is happening. And we would do well to really understand it, because I think that change has been just extraordinary. And we sometimes don't realize how much better things are. 80% of the children in the world are vaccinated right now. I mean, like something like 80 or 90% of young boys and young girls are educated. So things are changing. And the question is, how do we keep doing that? And my point is obvious. So anyway, I think that's where we start, is what's the best way to move forward on that? How much leeway do we give to the free market, and how much do we expect from governments?
Okay. Yeah, actually, I'm going to grab something quickly. Because you had sent me this book, and I haven't finished it yet, but I did finally get a chance to start reading it, Factfulness by Hans Rosling, and it was interesting, if you recall in that book, that there was, he would give a bunch of people tests, a series of multiple choice tests about the state of the world, the economy, poverty, famine, that sort of thing. And he did begin with, what he found was that most people didn't understand that the world is actually in a pretty good state right now. And a lot of the points that you were just bringing up, I think that, that he approached the fact that, poverty is at record lows, and all that really should be acknowledged before moving forward as to whether we should do more, do less, or maintain that we are at one of the best places that we've been in globally, and need to be addressed. And you mentioned that the U.S. poverty is the standard we use to determine poverty is a little bit higher than it would be in other places.
Yep.
We do it based on an economic measure. When I was looking it up, they said, if I recall, that for a family of four, the poverty level is around $27,000, depending on if there's two wage earners or one wage earner, but it's around that price point at this point in time. And of course, it changes year to year based on inflation and other things. So I do want to first say that yes, that it has improved dramatically. I think one of the mistakes that some people make is they say, well, it's much better than it has ever been, so what are you complaining about? And I think that's an unfortunate perspective, because it's better than it's ever been, and it could still be better still. And so there should be a continued striving of improving people's economic state, so that we get that 10% level globally, and some of these kids that are going to school hungry here in the U.S., that we fix that to where it's not happening at all. That would be my perspective.
Agree 100%. I think the only question we'd have is, what's the best way to get there? And what has been done in recent history that's been the best method for achieving that reduction in poverty, I think, is the question. Because, yeah, of course, nobody is, when I say all those things, hey, things are really great, and Hans Rosling says, things are really great. Well, nobody's saying, well, yeah, it's only 10% of the kids that are starving. And, you see those horrible pictures of starving kids in Africa. Well, it's not that many people. I mean, if it were one, we'd want to do what we could to alleviate it. The question becomes, what's going to be the best thing that we can do to alleviate it?
Sure.
And I certainly have some thoughts on that.
I hope so. Otherwise, this will be a short conversation.
Yeah. So when we look at, what should be done, what's interesting, another thing that I put in my notes, I don't know how far you got into it. It was probably a little boring, but it's amazing the amount of money that the U.S. government is spending on poverty in the U.S. in our country. I mean, if we talk, first about our country, because we should probably look here first. There's things we can do elsewhere, but we have to be loyal to our citizens, and that should be our highest priority. Although helping people in other countries, I don't mind having that priority as well. I think we do well to help people financially in other countries, because if they're happy and content, I don't think then I think we're much safer. It's difficult to convince, for example, people that are very well off, that have a ton of economic and political freedom. It's very hard to convince them to be suicide bombers, just as an example. if people feel like they have their freedom, at least to some degree, then they're going to be appeased and not wanting to go around and do something crazy. They should still continue to fight for more rights if they don't have all of their rights, but at least they're going to have some level of contentment and not anger against other places. But yeah, the amount of money we spend, upwards of I can't remember what the number was, but upwards of $200 billion every year in our country. We're spending massive amounts of money on poverty. And one chart that I thought was really interesting, it looked at poverty levels in our country, and it ran from the early 1900s until today. And what we can see is right about until the mid 1960s, poverty was falling off very, very rapidly in our country. And so when and I think this is important because I think it illustrates something about what we've been doing. Because in the 1960s, Lyndon Johnson declared the war on poverty, which I think is a very noble goal. We all want to help those people. But after the mid 1960s, that poverty level just leveled out and stopped. I mean, it's amazing how quickly it was falling off, and then how quickly or how little has happened since. It's been kind of up and down year over year, probably due to recessions and other things. But yeah, I mean, we have not made a dent in poverty in spite of the fact that from that point, we began focusing so much on it. And, to me, there seems a simple explanation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But I was reading a lot about means-tested welfare programs. And means-tested, the way I understood it when I looked at the definitions of it was, what are people's means or their ability to be able to support themselves? And so a lot of these programs, they'll say, okay, well, if you make below a certain income level, then we'll give you a certain amount of assistance, whether food or money or anything else. And it also has to do with marriage. If, for example, there's a woman that she's a single mom, or she's just single and she gets welfare. Well, if she gets married, that could change her status with the U.S. government. And then she loses that ability to receive that assistance. And so when we look at that war on poverty, it seems to me that what's happened since the 1960s is a great emphasis on those means-tested programs. And so many of those programs end up having an implicit tax on people. There was another chart I sent you that looked at Virginia in particular. And if people achieved a certain income level, then they would lose their benefits. And so, for example, let's say they're making $20,000, then they make 21, they might lose welfare or food stamps. Well, these are great people. And so, of course, I think that's where we get caught up between, the left-leaning people that say, hey, we should be helping others, and then right-leaning people that say, well, if we help them too much, they're going to lose their incentive to work. Well, it does happen. I mean, if you have people that say, hey, if I earn another dollar or another $1,000, I could lose a lot of my benefits. That's an implicit tax on those people because they know if they make more money, they lose some of their benefits. They can't make a jump of $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000. They've got to make a jump of $20,000 or $30,000 in order to make enough money to cover those programs that they're losing out on. Am I making sense with that?
Yeah. Yep. Yes. I don't know if it's something that you are familiar with. Given it would depend a lot on your taxable income and your personal finances. But with the healthcare, the Affordable Care Act, often referred to as Obamacare, when that went into effect, there was some government assistance in terms of tax benefits, depending on your personal income. Now, what happened with that particular program was that there was not a threshold where once you surpassed it, you got no assistance. It was a gradual decrease in assistance over the course of tens of thousands of dollars. And I don't remember what the actual range was. And so one of the advantages there is that a dollar an hour raise that one might get isn't going to make the difference between a zero payment per month or an $800 payment per month. It might make the difference between a zero payment per month and maybe $100 payment a month. So that you don't have that same worry about losing the benefits. because you feel like, yes, there might be a gain on one end while you're losing at the other, but it allows for again the desire to keep moving forward or upward, I guess, economically.
Mm-hmm.
I do understand what you're saying, and I think you're right that at a certain point there are certain expenses that are really expensive in terms of that have a big impact on someone's personal finances, and one of them that we've recently experienced is childcare. That there was some childcare assistance that was that a lot of people were feeling, and there I only saw the headline, so I really didn't dig into it. It doesn't affect me, so I wasn't as in my limited time motivated to really explore it. But I had heard that when those childcare benefits were not renewed, that it did have a big impact on two parents being able to go out and work. Suddenly, one parent had to stay home to take care of their children, and it did push people, down below the poverty line when they had to start looking at alternative healthcare or childcare payments. So I do understand what you're saying, and I think it is something that we need to be attentive to.
Yeah, and I think that's a very valid point. There's plenty that I would say of other things that are, I would say, negatively about Obamacare, but that's one that I think at least there was some thought that went into it to try to. And I don't know. I mean, like you, I haven't done the exact research to say, well, if you made an extra $1,000, does that mean that your healthcare costs went up by 1,000? So, or, does it mean that your healthcare costs went up by 800? So there's some incentive still to keep working. Like, we should be thinking about all of those things. Two things that I would say is, when we talk about people that are below the poverty line in our country, one thing that I think gets lost in all of this, especially when people are trying to prove their point, and, it's become somewhat of an emotional argument. Well, why wouldn't you help these people? There's so many people living in poverty. Well, at least my understanding of it is when these people are they're not living in poverty in the sense that they're getting assistance, which would and oftentimes raise them above the poverty line. So when we talk about the number of people living in poverty, it's actually less than that because we're helping them, which is great. I mean, I don't want people to live, in difficult financial circumstances, but we should remember that there's not that when you look at the number of people that are below the poverty line in our country, that's before you account for the fact that they're receiving assistance. Another thing I would say is, yes, I agree 100%. We should be thinking about what incentives we give people. And many times when I talk about this, if I say, well, we don't want to incentivize people not to work, then the counter argument is, well, are you just accusing these people of being lazy? And I'm like, no, I'm not that. I mean, they're intelligent, or they've only got so much time in the day. And if they know that I work a little bit extra, but I'm actually going to be $5,000 worse off, they've got to make difficult choices. So they're going to have to make those decisions. But further to that point, there's two things that I would talk about that I think could kind of help us. The first one I don't like as much. It's, what is it called? Andrew Yang was putting for it where everybody gets a certain amount of money.
Universal income.
Universal basic income, which, and I would only be in support of a program like this, and I have one that's a little bit better than universal income. But if we were to take away other programs, so for example, we would say instead of food stamps or welfare or something else, we say, okay, well, universal basic income. So there's not an increase in taxes. We just say to people, hey, listen, we want everybody to have the means to be able to support themselves. So everybody gets X amount of dollars every month to just help cover their basic needs. And then maybe for people that are, for example, they have some debilitating disease that they just can't do anything, we could give a little more assistance to them. But everybody else, we'd say, listen, you get the bare minimum. It's not going to be a ton of money, but we're going to take away these other programs. Milton Friedman, the libertarian economist, he talked about a negative income tax. And the negative income tax would set a certain threshold and say, if you make below a certain amount of money, let's say $30,000 or $20,000, I don't know what it would be, and probably different based on the household size. But you'd say, okay, well, if it's $20,000 and somebody makes $18,000, well, then we give them another $2,000. If they make $22,000, then they have a small amount of taxes. But any increase, we have them pay less taxes So for example, if they go from 18,000 to 19,000, they don't get $1,000 less in assistance. They get something like $800 less in assistance. So there's always some incentive to be working harder. And that negative income tax, we don't want to spend too much going through the specifics of it today, but essentially it incentivizes people that need it most, because people that are well off, like you and I, we probably don't need a universal basic income. If we removed all the incentives that are insurance companies, all the inefficiencies in insurance, I think insurance costs and healthcare costs would definitely come down. There's a lot of things that we're doing to restrict the free market in that case. But if we took away a lot of this other assistance and we just said, okay, a negative income tax that allows people to increase their earnings, and when they do, they're not punished. Even if you said, for example, okay, well, somebody earns an extra $1,000, they get $1,000 less in incentives. Then if it's a single mom and she's got kids running around, what's she going to do? She's only got so much time in the day. If I were her, I would just keep the $1,000 in assistance, because then she's got more time to devote to her kids. There should be some incentive for people to work harder and earn more, and we shouldn't be taking away that assistance as quickly as they get it. But we certainly should not be the way we do now with these means-tested programs, taking, like, when they earn more money, then we take away the program completely. When I know somebody who lives in the Northeast that she makes a certain amount of money, and if she makes any more money, then she loses her health insurance benefits that she gets from the state government. And there's two thresholds. If she gets to a certain point, then she loses half of the assistance. If she gets, $5,000 or $10,000 more than that, then she loses the assistance completely. So what incentive does she have to work harder, to earn more, she might even avoid a proposed raise from her boss, because she knows that raise is not going to be as much as the assistance that she's getting.
Yeah, sure. I totally agree with that. When you're talking about a pretty expensive family cost like health insurance, to go from all or nothing to, it could be $500 a month, it could be $1,000 a month, depending on your circumstances. And to say that, you go from a zero payment to $500 a month payment because your income bumped up by $1 is not a real healthy situation, because you do have people that are wondering, do I want to work harder? Do I want to better my situation, where I could start to lose some of those benefits I'm getting from the state? And I think that graduated assistance is probably a better solution, where it's not going to be quite as painful to start to work your way up. When we talk about the poverty line, I think one of the things that's important is to recognize what the numbers actually mean. I said that for a family of four with two incomes, the poverty level is $27,500 basically. What that boils down to is about $14 an hour. Now, that number is interesting because there's a lot of talk about raising the national minimum wage to $15 an hour. So that would mean that at $15 an hour, that there would be, if everyone was making $15 an hour, no one would be below the poverty line if they had with one income, I think it was. But if you look at what that number actually means for people, assume a 25% tax on that income, that would mean monthly about $1,700 a month that they get. Now, according
there's no way they would pay a 25% tax.
There isn't? When you include things like Social Security and employment tax and everything else, isn't 25% like total 25% deduction in total take-home pay, isn't in state tax and everything? Isn't that a reasonable number?
I wouldn't think so, not at all. It depends on how you look at the Social Security tax, because Social Security and Medicare are like 7.4%. Really, your employer is paying the other half of it. Maybe if you looked at it that way, you get close. But yeah, 25. They'd have, if it's a single income, they've got three dependents. No, I wouldn't think you'd see 25%. I don't think I was paying that much, even recently.
I've been I've been self-employed for so long, and having an accountant do all that stuff for me, I really have no idea what the payment or what the tax rates actually are. He takes care of it all for me. So don't think I don't know just because I'm living in some ivory tower, just taking baths in my money sort of thing.
No, I think most of us, I think you're absolutely right. The code is so complex that we don't really know what the answer is. And it's set up in a way. What's interesting about the income tax is if we all had to pay it at the end of the year, I think we'd fight much harder against taxes. But because it comes out so automatically, it's almost as if we're pacified.
Right.
But I would say this. The other thing is when you talk about, and I don't want to get bogged down in this, the point you're trying to make, but I just don't want to let that go. 25%, that's a high number for people. I don't think that's anywhere near correct. I think that's way off.
Okay.
And if you said, it's funny when you say Social Security because really that's their money.
Yeah, but maybe they're taking it out. Monthly bills.
Okay, but so you're just saying maybe what we're trying to talk about is take-home income or something like that. Yeah. I don't know. I wouldn't guess that you'd get, even if you counted Social Security and Medicare. I mean, it's 7.5%. I don't think they're getting too much higher than 10%. I wouldn't think.
Okay, well, I can still make my point. Let's assume that someone making at the poverty level is actually paying zero in taxes because of all the benefits and everything else that comes along. They're getting every single penny that they earn. They're getting all that back. What that means then is that let me do that number again. I've got my calculator out right now.
And what you're not counting is benefits that they receive. So are you counting in there that they get food stamps, maybe some welfare?
Well, again, that's not usable cash. Now it does, of course, it does alleviate some of your bills, but
that's the same as usable cash. If you can buy food, if you don't have to use your cash for food, then and you get $500 in food stamps, that's cash because you don't have to. You're going to have more than $500.
Bear with me. If you had $500 come annually, that's $2,200, $2,300 monthly.
Okay.
Now, at that level, according to different people, you're supposed to be spending 30% of your income for housing. So 30% of that is $687.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you've got a family of four, let's say that you're going to live, frugally and have a 2-bedroom apartment. You and your spouse are going to be in one room, and that your 2 kids are going to share another room. The cheapest apartments that I could find in the U.S. for a 2-bedroom were in Arkansas, and the average price was $856. So without any sort of government assistance, you're not making enough right there in order to be able to pay for your housing in the least expensive state within the country. And of course, that's an average. So you might be able to find 2 apartment houses that are less expensive than the average, without a doubt. But also keep in mind that that's the cheapest state within the country. And you go to a place, California, New York City, wherever it might be, you're not going to get anywhere close to that. Now, of course, we have government assistance in housing. You have to apply for it, and there has to be space for you within those housing projects, or within the Section 8 housing, or whatever else that it is. And my understanding is that it can be very difficult to find places where you can get that sort of assistance where it can be useful. So yes, there are government programs, but at that rate, you're not getting much to work with, and there's nothing out there that's for you. And that's just in housing. We could break it down some of the other categories as well and see why that government assistance becomes so important.
Yeah, I think there's a danger here, Brian. And you're probably going to smirk at this a little bit, but I think the danger is the government creates a ton of problems. It raises prices, and then we say, "Hey, we need the government to help these people because otherwise they couldn't survive." You know what I mean? I think so much of the housing issues that we have are due to government regulations.
Explain. I know where you're going, but say it out loud.
Yeah. So just as an example, there's a ton of restrictions, especially in certain parts of the country, regarding high density housing. Another one is when there's rent control in certain areas of the country. So I'll explain those a little bit deeper. So the high density housing, for example, there's some people that say, well, I don't want an apartment complex close to me. I like the view. Well, they can say that, and maybe they even have the right to enforce that. But when you do that, you're going to have less high density housing available for people, and housing becomes more expensive. If we built in this country, we said the only thing you can build is single family homes on 1 acre, well, then housing would be much more expensive on average in our country, because you just can't fit that many people into a small area. High density housing makes it much less expensive to build, much less expensive to manage, and that's going to give opportunity to people. Another one that we would talk about is this rent control that they have in many areas of the country. They have rent control, and what happens is, if there's an apartment building, many times in big cities, especially, apartment buildings will sit vacant because they're not allowed to charge enough for rent to make it worth their while to run the apartment building. And no new people want to come in and build new apartment buildings because they know that with the rent controls in place, they just can't make enough money to be able to support their investment. So I think what the government, often does is create these problems, and then we say, well, without government, these people don't have enough to live. The other thing I'd say is, you said, well, it's almost as if you're crafting an argument to make your point. Yeah, we would love to have it be 30%, but when you say unless they can get 30% of their income paying for their housing, you're forgetting the fact that they could pay 40 or 50% and cut back in other areas. They could do without a cell phone, at least for many of the kids. I mean, there's things that people can do, and families can make sacrifices to be able to afford these different types of things. But overall, I'd say, yeah, there is a problem. As long as the assistance is like we talked about, and it's not punitive for people to do better. I'm not saying today we should just cut out every program to people or do away with it. What I'm saying is we should be thoughtful, as we talked about at the first, about how we implement it. So we can go to, try to craft an argument to say, well, without government assistance, they're not going to be helpful. But nobody's arguing for no government assistance. We're just saying, let's be thoughtful about how we implement, which today we're not.
I'll be honest. I was expecting to hear that from you, that we should get rid of government assistance altogether. So I'm.
Oh, you were?
Well, yeah. I mean, that has been a theme that runs through.
No. I have never said get rid of government. I have always said, in every conversation that we've ever had, I've always said there should be a basic social safety net. Yeah. Nobody wants to feel like, and I don't even think we leave it up to charity completely. I think charity should have more of a role, but, I don't think, like, for example, if somebody knocks on my door and they're starving to death, could I turn them away? I don't think so. Like, it's easy to, talk in political terms and say how people should be working hard or whatever, but we realize there are people that we need to help. Mm-hmm. And so then all we have to do is think about the best way to do it. And many times I think, arguments from the left, are so emotional in how they go about things. So we talk about, for example, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. I think this illustrates some of the many problems that I have with government programs and how they're implemented. When I was working at a company not too long ago, I was in charge of choosing our healthcare program, our insurance program. Well, at first we didn't have one. And Obamacare has a requirement that once you have over 50 employees, you are required to put an insurance program in place.
Right.
And so and when we did it, we weren't quite ready because we didn't have enough money to be paying for a health insurance program, because it becomes necessary for that company to pay a large portion of the healthcare costs. Well, there were certain people that worked for us. I can remember 2 families. They were working moms. I think they were 2-parent working families, and they were getting a fair, like you could go online and figure out how much assistance somebody would be getting. And we put in their family size, where they were living, and how much money they were making, because we had their payroll information. And we could see that they were getting like $800 in assistance from the federal government in order to cover their healthcare costs. So they were paying like $100 a month in healthcare. Well, because Obamacare forced us to have this program, and the program for them, because they were working for a company that offered health insurance, they were no longer eligible for that assistance.
Right.
So we couldn't afford to give all of our employees, $800 worth of assistance in their healthcare. That would have been, would have buried us financially. So we had to give them far less. So those families, we knew right then that they weren't allowed to be given, or that they were going to be far worse off. And we couldn't even give them raises. Like if the federal government realized that we were giving certain people in our company raises to, essentially to cover their healthcare costs, unless we gave it to everybody, give a raise across the board to everybody, then they would say that we were being discriminatory.
Sure.
So we had to treat these people and put them in a position where they were worse off financially than they were before. Now, I don't think I know that wasn't the intent of Obamacare, but these weird programs where they're trying to control how much all these different things are happening cause a lot of problems. That's just one small example. I could give a ton of them of how these programs kind of pick and choose winners, not intentionally oftentimes, but they pick and choose winners and losers, and it makes things much worse off than before.
I'm not calling you a Republican. What I'm about to say, because I know that I know it's a label that you do not like to have put upon you. I know that if you were going to take any label, you'd call yourself a libertarian. And so what I'm about to say is not so much directed at you, but more directed if we, talk about our two-party system, which we've already agreed is a messed up system. But what happens with our two-party system is that we have the Republican solution and the Democrat solution, and when we look at the healthcare, it's people have been complaining about it for years. They're still complaining about it. Maybe they'll be complaining about it for centuries to come. And while I would agree that that the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, is not a great solution, it was the only solution that's been put forth in the last 40 years or whatever, 60 years, that actually tried to address it in a meaningful way. And so whenever I hear about, complaints about that particular solution, my response generally is, well, what else have we had? For the last 4 years when Trump was president, every couple months he'd be out there saying, my healthcare plan will be out in a moment. You're going to love my healthcare. We need to get rid of Obamacare and put out my healthcare. He never came out with it. And so just like with Obamacare and all of the other safety net programs that we have, I don't think it's smart to remove an existing program until you have a good replacement program, or at least modify the existing program that you have in place to suit whatever your needs are. So first of all, yeah, it's not a great solution, but it is a solution. Are there people that were hurt by it? Absolutely. In the same way, there are when they put out the seatbelt laws, when they mandated seatbelts, there were all these stories coming out about people that had their lives saved because they weren't wearing a seatbelt. But the truth remains that the majority of people that are in accidents benefit by wearing a seatbelt. There are examples of those that are not, but most people benefit by the seatbelt. So yes, in your example, there are a few people, and there are probably lots of people that were hurt by the rules that Obamacare brought about. But I think the fact remains that most people benefited by that healthcare. Were there better programs that could have been implemented? Sure. And someday, maybe the Republicans will offer their own solution, and we'll see what that looks like.
Well, first off, I find it hard to believe that no Republican has ever submitted a healthcare plan in the last 60 years. I'm sure I could find an example of where they did.
Okay, implemented. Let's not say offered, but implemented.
Yeah, that's fair. But just saying, I don't know. Yeah, just saying, well, it must be that things are better off because we've done something. I don't believe that at all. I mean, I haven't researched exactly how much, things are better or worse. What we can say is we have one of the most expensive healthcare programs in the world.
Yeah.
And it's not that great.
I would agree with you.
So saying, and I could give you, a ton of examples of how government is restricting competition. I just gave you one of an example of how, well, I guess it's not really restricting competition, but I gave you a ton of examples also of how government is restricting competition in the healthcare marketplace. And so, when we talk about, it's almost as if, and this is the idea that I was talking about before, when we say, well, we need government. Government creates a problem and then says the only way we can solve this is through more government. And we could talk about a ton of examples of restricting competition. I mean, we've talked about it in this podcast about how there was a moratorium on new doctors between 1980 and 2005. I've talked to you before about how health insurance doesn't cross state lines. I've talked to you before about how you can't take a deduction for your health insurance premiums if you're not employed, if it's not an employer offered healthcare plan.
Oh, I know.
I've just, there's all sorts of issues that we have with the healthcare marketplace. And then we say, well, it's inefficient. We need government to make things better for us. And we just keep digging ourselves further and further into this hole of it not being a very efficient system for us. Just one example, like we say, well, government, at least they're trying to help people. Another example that you and I think have talked about recently is, well, I don't want to, maybe we shouldn't get off track on this one. I was going to talk about the nuclear power problems that we have in our country. There hasn't been a new nuclear power plant come online since the 1970s.
Right.
And it's the safest and one of the most cost-effective ways to produce energy. It's one of the cleanest, and it's far cleaner than and far more environmentally friendly than even wind or solar. Yet the government has stopped us from implementing new nuclear power in our country for the last 50 years. Sure. So to say, well, the government does stuff, well, at least they're trying to help people. At least we're doing something. No, oftentimes I think they make things far worse, and then things get even worse, and they say, well, we need to do more because look how bad things are. Well, they created the problem in the first place. And I realize I may be making a high-level argument, it's kind of difficult to prove, but no, I don't think things are better off because of Obamacare. Sure, there might be individuals that were better off, but when you create all these problems in an industry and just make things more and more difficult for businesses to succeed, that is going to make things worse off for the country. And I think that's the danger you have in general in alleviating poverty. When we look at the poverty level since the 1960s, they've gotten far worse. Sorry to babble on and probably make more than one point.
Well, I mean, yes, you have brought up some points in which the government has gotten involved, and one could argue that some situations have gotten worse. At the same time, I could bring up some arguments where the government gotten involved and some of the situations have gotten a little bit better. And so when you go and try and go, I don't want to call it a tit for tat, but to go and pull up examples of effective governance and incompetent governance, you're always going to, we could go all day long. In the same way, we could take a look at how the free market economy has benefited in some circumstances and has hurt in others. So I'm not sure that that's the most effective way to go about having this argument, because if I were to go and say, here's an example of the government doing something well, let's say prohibiting children from working under the age of 12. Or 15 or whatever it might be, you would say your response would be, yeah, good job, government. That's some place where we need the government to be involved. Perhaps, maybe you wouldn't say that. I don't know. But when we go and look at the over with some, I agree with nuclear power. I think that one is something that the government should actually be looking at again and implementing. I think it is a green energy that should be involved. It's often difficult when we look at some of the things. If we bring the argument back to poverty, or the discussion, we're not arguing, bring our discussion back to poverty. When you look at that dramatic drop in the 50s, primarily, that dramatic drop happened almost entirely in the older population, the over 65s. And that dramatic drop can be found to be the implementation of Medicaid and Medicare.
Now, it wasn't just the 50s, it was from the early 1900s.
That's not what I saw in the graphs that I saw. It looked like the graphs that I saw that they were the graphs started in like the 40s or 50s. Now, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying that the information that I found had a different start date because the information wasn't available a lot further back. So I'm happy to see further information on that. But what I did find was that the drop can be due to government programs. So there we have an example of a pretty extensive government program that had a pretty dramatic impact on poverty levels. I think it is unfortunate that we haven't seen a much changed impact on other populations. But what's also interesting is that 12, 14% poverty rate that has been consistent since the mid 60s. The population has not been consistent, so that we have a growing population that has been considered living below the poverty line in the U.S., and that's something that we do need to be worried about, or I guess concerned about. And just as we should be concerned by the amount of money that we're throwing at the problem without having much of a solution, a solution to that problem. Are you looking at the chart right now?
I'm trying to look it up, but it's on my phone. I don't have I was trying to find it, but I'm certain it did not start in the 1940s and 50s. I'm certain that it started in the early 1900s and was falling pretty precipitously until then. It was not just due to Social Security. It had, it's an interesting one. Yeah, Social Security. Maybe we should have a discussion about Social Security someday.
Let's do it.
I wonder what mostly because I'd love to find more about it. I mean, it's interesting. We just kind of assume that it's a good idea when we don't. I mean, man, I just wonder, Brian, I think when my Social Security statement said something like, if I continue on this path, I'll get something like $2,500 a month or $3,000 a month when I retire. And then I think about the amount of money. I mean, 15% of it's like 13% because 1.5 or 2% is going to Medicare, but 13% of my income every year is going towards Social Security for 40 or 50 years. And all I'm going to get for it is like $2,500 to $3,000 a month. If we compared what we're expecting to get from Social Security to what we would get if we estimated something like a 4% or a 5% return, over the next 40 or 50 years, we're doing, 13% of our income. I don't even think it would come close. So,
I mean, it's not intended to get a return of 5%. It was intended to get a return of like 1 or 1.5% because it's the bare bones safety nets invested in treasury bonds. But I would love to have that conversation. Probably not right now. In fact, we're getting near a point where we should start to wrap this up. So, if there's anything that you want to follow up with what we've talked about so far, feel free to bring it up now or summarize or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, it's interesting how we started because we started and agreed that, government programs can have the tendency to disincentivize people. And I think you were surprised to hear that I would do away with I don't want to do away with all social safety nets because no, I of course don't want that. What I think, and perhaps when people make the argument when it's Republicans against Democrats, Republicans sometimes get in this place where they're saying, no, we can't give people money because they almost forget where they're coming from, which is, no, we are okay with helping people. Everybody, in fact, I think capitalism has done a tremendous amount to help alleviate poverty in the world. I think the reason we see the last 200 years the reduction in poverty is because of capitalism. Now, as I said before, it's impossible to have a free market. It's impossible to have the capitalism that we've had without government interference, but it should be minimal. So I think we started out with, it should be minimal. We should be kind of cognizant of incentives that people have and ensuring that they're not incentivized to work less. And then we kind of got into the specifics of certain programs. But I do feel like there's a lot of agreement between you and I on this subject, which is we should at least be thinking about the fact that what we're going to do is going to have unintended consequences. Economists should be involved in the setting of policy because they can help us to see where these incentives will lead us to some degree. They're not going to be perfect at predicting it either, but we should be at least aware of that. So if we disagree on certain programs, I think there is agreement, at least in the idea that we should be thinking about what people's incentives are.
I would agree. And in fact, I would go one step further and say that I'm betting we're going to agree that some of those government programs are not as nuanced as they should be. For example, when they look at the poverty threshold, they have a number that's national. And it doesn't pay attention at all to the particular areas that you live in. So somebody living in Arkansas that has the least expensive housing is going to have the same poverty threshold as someone living in the most expensive city in the US, which doesn't make any sense at all. There should be some awareness to what the economic environment is. I can't believe that in all the years that they've been doing these unemployment programs, that somebody hasn't come along and tried to fix some of these broader problems that are pretty easy to solve. I think that when you look at something like the poverty line, I think that it shouldn't be too hard to have it addressed at the weekly or monthly payment or the payroll, so that just like when we make the claim of how many dependents we have, and they figure out how much they're going to deduct from your taxes. If they were to do something similar to that, to determine, maybe having a graduated tax rate based on what you're expected to make that year. I mean, it shouldn't be that hard, but apparently it's beyond the government's ability. They can get somebody on the moon, maybe rumored to have somebody on the moon, but we can't get a simple solution to taxes or some of these government assistance programs. So that's my
the negative income tax, I agree, could be implemented on a weekly basis, and then just make it a part of they receive the assistance and true up at the end of the years. I mean, I think that I agree that seems a better way to do it.
Yeah. All right. So did you want to discuss Social Security next, or do you want to go on to something a little less, maybe a little lighter?
Yeah, we can do that. I mean, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what comes of it. I almost want to do it just because it would be interesting to do the research. I don't have. I tend to disagree with it in general, the way that it's implemented anyway. But yeah, we can research it. Maybe I'll find something that I don't know or learn something new about it. That'd be an interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges with these topics is I think that we could have talked about this topic for 4 more hours and explored some of the subtleties and does the some of the welfare system promote single parenting? That's been one of the accusations, and I don't know that they're I think there's something that we could have spent a lot of time on. There's other things I think that we could have talked about as well, and maybe we might decide to come back to it later on, but. If we're limiting it the way that we have, I feel like that, we're only going to get, a broad idea of the topic, and we're going to have to leave a lot of the topics uncovered just because we are limited in time. So if we cover Social Security next, and if you do find that graph or that information that you said about the decreasing rate of poverty going back to the early 20th century, go ahead and send it to me, and I'll throw it on here as well.
Okay, sounds good.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.